in order to understand the attraction of Robert Burns, you've really got to go back with the Battle of Bannockburn in the year 1314, when the Scottish army under Robert the Bruce defeated the English army under Edward II by that time, and it was one of the great military victories of all time in Scottish and English history. And in fact, it really sealed Scotland's independence as a country for the next 300 years. And at the beginning of that time, there was a document drawn up that has made its way into this country, and it was called the Declaration of Arbroath. And maybe some of you recognize the Declaration of Arbroath as being the thing that we celebrate on Tartan Day, which is on April the 6th. And it was on April the 6th in 1320, not long after Bannockburn, that the bishops and the landowners and the lairds and so on in Scotland drew up in Arbroath, and a long list of them signed it, a letter to the Pope asking for his assent to telling the King of England that he was not to interfere with the events of Scotland because of all that had gone on before. Here's a little excerpt from the Declaration of Arbroath. Yet it says, if he, that is, the King of England, should give up what he has begun and agree to make us our kingdom subject to the King of England or the English, we should exert ourselves at once to drive him out as our enemy and a subverter of his own rights and ours. And then it goes on, it is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. And then it goes on with all kinds of other stuff in that kind of vein. One thinks to oneself, my goodness, you could just about translate that into the American Revolution in the 1700s, and you could translate it into revolutions just about anywhere. Well, in the 1700s, disaster struck in the form of the Jacobite rebellions, and once again the Scots were defeated in battle both in 1715 and later at Culloden in 1745. And after that defeat, there was a real clampdown by not even just the English, but some of the very powerful Scottish lairds and so on. And the Duke of Cumberland, the Duke of Argyll, and many others as well helped the king in banning the plaid, banning the tartan, banning the bagpipes, banning all kinds of things that were Scottish, and the Scottish people were pretty well hammered into acquiescence after 1745. That is only 14 years before the birth of a child in a thatch roof cottage in Ayrshire, and the child's name was going to be Robert Burns in 1759. And little did anybody know that he was the one who, through poetry, was going to do more to bring the Scottish self-esteem as a nation back up to where it really ought to be than just about anybody else could have done. There were people of this about the same time. David Hume wrote philosophy, but goodness me, who reads philosophy when you can read a poem instead? And later on into the 18th century, you got Sir Walter Scott and Robert Louis Stevenson, and there were all kinds of people like this. But Burns was the one who, only a few years after the defeat at Culloden, was able to bring the Scots back to where they were by emphasizing what was important. There was one poem that I came across, and I'm not going to read it all because it's a long one, but it is called The Cotter's Saturday Night. And the cotter is a person who lives in a cottage, and he talks about these very, very poor family and about how the cotter is coming home from the fields at dusk, and the children run out to meet him, and he comes in, and they sit down as a family, and they eat their meal together, and they open the Bible, and they read together, and they pray together, and they do all kinds of things together, and they build their strength around about the family like this. And he spends about 3 or 4 pages of this book talking about this. And then he finishes up by saying this. It says, "From scenes like these," which is just described, "old Scotia's grandeur springs, that makes her loved at home, revered abroad. Princes and lords are but the breath of kings. An honest man is the noblest work of God." In other words, you can ignore Cumberland and Argyll and all these fancy falutin people. Never mind them. They have all the money and all the power, but we have what's really important. The honest man. "And certain fair virtue's heavenly road, the cottage leaves the palace far behind. What is a lordling's pomp? A cumbrous load, disguising oft the wretch of humankind, studied in arts of hell, in wickedness refined. O Scotia, my dear, my native soil, from whom my warmest wish to heaven is sent, long may thy hardy sons of rustic toil be blessed with health and peace and sweet content. And oh, may heaven their simple lives prevent from luxury's contagion and coronets be rent. A virtuous populace may rise the while, and stand a wall of fire around their much-loved isle." And it was in words like that that Robert Burns was able to make the Scottish people begin to see that they didn't need power and military might and all kinds of money that nobody could even imagine, all the rest of it. They just needed their good virtues and their honesty and their fundamental character. That was all that was needed. I've thought to myself, my goodness, there are people in all countries and all ages, including, dare I say, the one we live in at the present time. We could do well with listening to words such as that. But Robert Burns wrote them to the Scottish people in order to do just that. And I think that was probably the most important thing about Robert Burns. He filled it out, of course, with a lot of the virtues that he thought should be. A lot of them were addressed to himself. There was a writer in Edinburgh not so very long ago who was... Actually, it looked as though it was a kind of a sour grapes kind of speech. Everybody disagrees with him, but says, Robert Burns was a bit of a drunkard and an alcoholic, and he drank far too much, which is true, he did. And he loved the ladies far too much, which is true. He fathered, I think, about 9 children from about 6 different women, and during the course of the time, and he eventually did marry Jean Armour, and they had several children of their own, but there were others as well. So Robert Burns was nobody's saint, but you don't have to be a saint to be a poet. If you were, there wouldn't be any. Well, I'm going to just leave you with this kind of thought in mind. There was this very posh lady who was sitting in front of him in the church and was obviously very pleased with her makeup and her dress and her attire, and probably was fairly wealthy and well known in the community. Unfortunately for her, there was one of God's creatures called a louse, which was crawling up her back. "Ha! Where are you going, you crowling ferly? Your impudence protects you sorely. I canna say, but you strunt rarely our gauze and lace. Though faith I fear you dine but sparely on sic a place. Ye ugly creeping blasted oner, detested, shunned by saint and sinner, how dare you set your foot upon her, so fine a lady? Go somewhere else and seek your dinner on some poor body." And so he goes on to talk about it, and ends up with this famous verse. "Oh, would some power the giftie gie us, to see ourselves as others see us. It would fae mony a blunder free us and foolish notion. What airs and dress and gait would leave us an e'en devotion? Robert Burns was always at pains to point out what constituted a good virtue. Well, thanks for listening, and now it's time to get on and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.